Good afternoon, everyone, and hello from Nauru. On behalf of the Corruption Working Group of the Pacific Islands Law Officers Network, welcome to our webinar. My name's Andy Drew. I'm the current DPP here in Nauru. This webinar will highlight some of the issues that law and justice officers in the Pacific encounter when trying to differentiate between the common and long-established practice of gift giving and corrupt conduct, such as bribery or fraud. Before we begin, I kindly ask you to ensure that your microphone is on mute. Thank you. If you wish to ask a question, please enter it in the chat section and I will read it out at the end if time permits. Understanding whether a person has committed a corruption offense or has simply given a culturally acceptable gift is a well-known and complex problem for investigators, prosecutors, policymakers, and legislative drafters. Addressing this issue is difficult because gift giving, accepted norms, and traditional expectations look different in every country and can change from one province, tribe, or family group to the next. Unfortunately, in this webinar, due to illness of one of our advertised speakers, Ms. Josephine Pitma from Papua New Guinea, she's unable to join us today. I'm sure you will all join me in wishing Josephine a speedy recovery. However, I'm very pleased to be able to present our three speakers who will share their stories and thoughts on this issue. We're most grateful to our three learned speakers to have them avail their time today with us. Our first speaker is the former President of the Republic of Palau, His Excellency Mr. Johnson Toribiong. Mr. Toribiong has had a long and distinguished political career. Prior to being elected as the President of Palau, Mr. Toribiong was a senator, an ambassador, and was involved in drafting and amending the constitutions of both Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia. In addition to his political appointments, Mr. Toribiong is a practicing lawyer. He has practiced in multiple countries, including the United States of America, Guam, and Palau. Mr. Toribiong is well-versed in the subject of traditional customs, as he has been appointed to be a traditional chief in both Palau and FSM. Welcome, Mr. Toribiong.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Let me, first of all, convey my best wishes and greetings to all the listeners throughout the Pacific region. I consider you as my colleagues and cousins, distant cousins, as the case may be. My presentation will be on the crime of bribery in the context of Palauan tradition and culture. So I'd like to begin by reading the definition of bribery in our criminal code.
Now, please.
Can you hear me? And it reads, every person who shall unlawfully and voluntarily give or receive anything of value in wrongful and corrupt payment for an official act done or not done, to be done or not to be done, shall be guilty of bribery, and upon conviction thereof shall be imprisoned for not more than 5 years, and shall be fined 3 times the value of the payment made, and if no value is determinable, shall be fined $1,000. With that definition, I would like to turn on the common definition of bribery in the English-speaking jurisdictions. So I go to Webster Dictionary, and it defines bribery or bribe as money or favor given or promised in order to influence the judgment or conduct of a person in the position of trust. Then let me jump to the Palawan English Dictionary and give you the definition of bribery in our culture, because I think the language conveys the values of the people. So according to the English Palawan Dictionary, bribery or bribe is expressed in several words. The first one may not be so relevant, but it is also an important factor to be considered. The word is ub, C-H-U-B or ub, U-U-B, pronounced ub. This is defined as a gift, especially to a woman, in the hope of romantic relationship. At this time, I am representing a party in a case where public funds were used as ub to a lady. And that's a different crime. It's misuse of public funds or fraud. But anyway, that's a term that is used in our dictionary to define bribery. The next word that I came across is melu'l, M-E-L-U-C-H-E-L, melu'l. That literally means to carry something on your head. In this context, it's a basket that's full of delicacies, food, that's being carried on the head to be delivered to a traditional chief, your brother-in-law, or the head of the clan, or somebody in a position of power or influence. There is another word that's mengelu, M-E-N-G-E-L-U-C-H. That word is defined in our dictionary as, quote, to cajole, seduce, bribe, provide, or convince. There's another word, mengesuseu, M-E-N-G-S-E-S-E-U. It's defined as to try to persuade or encourage, tempt someone into coming along with a bait, convince someone into coming along on your side, bribe. Then there's the final word is ongade ding. Ding is the ear. Ongade ding is to plug the ears, to give money to somebody not to say anything he heard, to make his ears deaf, to bribe the witnesses. So with that, let me say that in the Palawan traditional society, these practices, these words express these practices, which were used constantly to win the favor of traditional leaders or influential persons of the community or your clan to advance one's position, status, and welfare. In the traditional Palawan villages, the people were in a way competing to earn the favors of the traditional leaders and people of influence and power, so that they can, in a way, get into their inner circle and be preferred residents of their villages. The practice were used to bring one into the inner circle of the rich, influential, and powerful people, or to cultivate friendship and cordial relationship in expectation of favors to be returned in the future. It is a form of traditional bribery that is done in a series of incremental contributions and services by giving money, food, and things of value over the years, so that it is not a quid pro quo act of bribery. In my opinion, this practice has been reduced over the years to an art of bribery. It's like diplomacy. And it's difficult to detect it because sometimes those who are good at doing this kind of bribery will spy on the chiefs or the public official as to what he wants, what he likes, in terms of food, in terms of things. And then they would deliver that, sometimes publicly, directly, in a public traditional function, but most often indirectly, like to the wife, like to the son, or the daughter, or a third person. So it's very difficult to detect. It's done in a subtle manner. I would say it has been reduced to an art form. It was also done within one's clan because your strength and status in your clan is based upon your bloodline and your services. So sometimes people who want to bear traditional titles will use money to influence the matriarchs, the women who appoint a person to be the head of the clan. It's a very subtle practice in Palau. It is a practice of exchanging favors and gifts to the high-ranking people. It's a form of a premium for one's insurance policy for the future times of need. Traditionally, giving favors and gifts was done openly so that the people will know that the one who gave favors has earned the higher rank more than what he was born into within the clan. So it's done to convince the clan members that he is the most helpful, the biggest contributor to the clan, and raise his status within the clan more than his bloodline. It's being practiced today. However, there's another word in Palawan that is pronounced ulewekla, U-L-E-C-H-E-U-K-L, which means to hold something behind you, to be hidden. This is giving to the high-ranking people, people of influence and power, secretly, which means it is a special favor that's being given. I think the best English translation is hush money or under the table money. And that's being practiced. So it's very difficult to detect this. But when a gift is given secretly, oftentimes it manifests corrupt intent or criminal intent. It can be considered hush money, in my view, and that's bribe money. Based on this practice, people give more to their relatives who are wealthy, who have power and influence, more than their poor relatives, because the expectation is favor to be given in return in time of need. It's being given often because if your parents and yourself give a lot to your clan, in a way, it's your insurance policy. At the time of birth of your child, at the time of the marriage, at the time of your death or your relative's death, people will show up to provide support. So there's a good intent behind the original practice of gift giving. The chiefs practiced gift giving because they are not compensated. And I think sometimes the chiefs kind of expect to be given gifts, to be given favors before they give you something that you want. So it's an art form. But this practice in this modern world has evolved into a corrupt practice. Now in our society, I have a lot of friends. We in Palau chat a lot. And some of my friends always refer to one of them who has gained favor by public officials in state governments and national government. And they would say that he has been practicing omalul, delivering of food. That's the term they used. And therefore he has gained the favors of the powerful, the officials in public office. Let me say that this practice of giving gifts and favors to our high-ranking people, to the traditional chiefs, is so deeply entrenched in our culture that the Congress, the Olbira Lulao, has amended the law, the Code of Ethics Law, it's RPPL number 5-32, which defined public officials and require them to file financial statements regularly so that they can justify the money given to them or the money paid by them. But subsequently, that code of ethics was amended by our Congress and approved by the president to exempt traditional leaders who occupy public offices. So they exempt. And our society is composed of clans. Out of each clan comes a chief who is a member of the traditional council of chiefs of his village. But under our constitution, we have 16 what we call states, the former traditional states or villages. And the highest ranking chief of those 16 states become members of the National Council of Chiefs under Article 38, Section 6 of the Constitution. And they are advisors to the president on matters involving traditions and customs and their relationship to the Constitution and to the laws of the Republic of Palau. So they get paid at that level. Then we have 16 traditional communities or states which have been organized to be called states. And those state governments are mandated by the Constitution to be established based upon democratic principles and traditions of Palau. So in every state, you find many traditional leaders who are members of state legislatures, not because they were elected, by virtue of their traditional titles. At the same time, in most public lands in Palau are managed and owned by state land authorities. And the traditional leaders are also members of those land authorities. So they have control in many cases over the administration and management of public lands, like the leases of public lands. So they have influence over public lands. So the custom and practice of bribery, the art of omalul, is so deeply entrenched that it's very difficult, as I say, for law enforcement officers to detect bribery. It's done in a subtle manner, it's done secretly, it's done behind closed doors, so to speak. It's hush money. And therefore, the investigators in Palauan society can see those actions through the lens of our culture. And it's not necessarily a crime. It's done in a very subtle, secretive manner. May I proceed further?
Yeah.
So in a way, I would say that unless the evidence is clear and convincing, it's difficult to detect bribery among Palauans and their officials, their in-laws, their friends. It's a small society. We are all interconnected. But I found a few bribery cases reported, which all involve foreign participants. There's a case of Nakatani versus Nishizono, 2, Republic of Palau, in room 7, 1990. That involves a governor of a state and many, many Japanese investors. It was a multi-million-dollar case with multiple parties. And there were accusations of money changing hands. The court did not find any bribery here, but the foreigners are always playing a key role in the cases in Palau that I came across in bribery. There's a case of ROP versus Zhang Ping. That's 10 ROP 191. That's 2002 case involving a Chinese paying a Palauan immigration officer to fix his defective passport so he can travel through Palau somewhere else. There's a case of Yona versus Republic of Palau, 12 ROP 159, 2005. That's also a case of bribery involving an Indian who came to Palau to recruit employees from India to work in Palau, and he was found guilty with a Palauan guy working for the government in the labor office of bribery. So in conclusion, the act of bribery is difficult to detect unless the evidence constitute the act based on quid pro quo. Let me say that foreign nationals who engage in bribery, in my experience, usually Asians, they give, when they come to Palau, they do their own gift-giving tradition, which is okay. They give bags of tea, liquor, sometimes wristwatches, cigarettes. But that initial gift-giving to our officials at the port of entry, at public offices, has really tempted many of our employees or officials to engage in what I refer to as reverse bribery, where the public officials, having been exposed to that practice and knowing that they're foreigners, would then give suggestions, subtle suggestions, that unless you give them favors or gifts, they're not going to grant you what you wish. And therefore, usually the act of bribery in Palau is hard to detect unless evidence is clear and convincing, unless there's specific intent. In my opinion, the act of exchanging gifts has made the investigation of public officials engaging in the crime of bribery very, very difficult to detect. Let me say that from my experience, bribery has been transferred from the non-public official to the public official to demand gifts. I refer to that as reverse bribery. And that's done in my experience at the port of entry, at the tax office. From my experience, a container comes in with merchandise and there's a bribery going on. I have cases, and they would change, say, the list of the inventory of assets from being cigarettes, which is highly taxed, to say dry packages of noodles, for example, or to reduce the amount of the taxable merchandise. At the same time, I like to bring to attention also the enforcement of illegal drugs. I defend a lot of people accused of drug trafficking. And the act of bribery was so active that the last two chief law enforcement officers over drugs were convicted of possession because a lot of money changed hands in that criminal enterprise. So I submit that it's very difficult to detect bribery among Palauans and even among Palauans and foreigners coming in. I recommend, in my opinion, that those who work at the port of entry be presumed to have been engaged in some wrongdoing if they instantly have a big car or an expensive watch or a big house or to live beyond their means. That should become a law in Palau. Those who work at points where bribery usually takes place should be required to prove instant acquisition of wealth. Same as drug law enforcement officers. They should be subject to the same standard to justify whatever they have and to be subject to drug test. I say this because it takes a lot of planning and undercover investigation to be able to arrive at the destination where you can actually charge and convict people who corrupt our society. Finally, the Palawan custom of ongadiring, to make people deaf, is practiced. Reminds me of the three monkeys. I didn't hear, I didn't see. I'm not going to say anything. That's my presentation, and thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for that very interesting presentation. We're leaving the questions to the very end of the program, so hopefully there'll be some interesting questions that's going to be posed to you.
Thank you.
Our second speaker today is Mrs. Mele Lemaki Tagivakatini from the Office of the Solicitor General, which sits within the Department of Justice here in Nauru. Mele is an experienced expatriate legal officer who has been with the Department of Justice since 2017. Prior to working in the Office of the Solicitor General, Mele spent several years working in the Office of the Legislative Drafter. During that time, Mele assisted Nauru's Secretary for Justice and Border Control in providing support for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. In particular, Mele contributed to the review of Nauru's legal and institutional framework for implementation of chapters 2 and 5 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Mele was previously based in Fiji, where she worked for the Fijian Legal Aid Commission and the Fiji Inland Revenue and Customs Authority. Welcome, Mele.
Thank you, Andy, for the kind words. I'm just gonna share my my presentation. If you can just give me a few moments, please. Can you hear me well on the other side?
Yep, very well.
Okay.
Mojeko and good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to thank AGD, PILON, and everyone else involved in organizing this webinar, as well as the generous invitation made to Nauru to nominate a speaker to speak on this subject. I would also like to thank the government of Nauru for nominating me to speak on this subject today. In the interest of time, I will now get on with my presentation. For those who are not aware, Nauru joined the UNCAC on 11th August of 2012. On the 12th of July of 2012, Nauru deposited its instrument of ratification with the United Nations Secretary General. Nauru has also conducted its first cycle review and the second cycle review of the ANCAC. My presentation today will look at the customary obligation phenomenon of gift giving in Nauru against the backdrop of some anti-bribery laws, which allows customary obligation in some contexts. So I will be highlighting 4 laws of Nauru, that is the Public Service Act of 2016, the Leadership Code Act of 2016, and the Electoral Act of 2016 for the purposes of my presentation. Under Section 7 of the Public Service Act of 2016, it provides the public service values that are important for the public service. It also portrays the values that public service and its employees uphold in their service to the general public. One of the values of a public service employee, just like for any other country, is to have the highest ethical standards. Further, a public service employee is required to have the highest standards of accountability and transparency. Still under the Public Service Act of 2016, Section 8 provides the Code of Conduct for public service employees. Any public service employee who breaches the Code of Conduct will be subject to disciplinary action. A public service employee is required to behave honestly and with integrity at all times, behave in a way that upholds the public service values and the integrity and reputation of the public service. Now, moving on to the Leadership Code Act of 2016, this statute establishes the Office of Ombudsman, and it also sets the minimum standards of behavior and conduct of leaders of Nauru. At Section 8 of our Leadership Code Act, it provides the list of leaders, and they include heads of department, ministers, and the president. Under Section 10 of our Leadership Code Act, it holds a significant importance for Nauru, given the cultural and traditional practices that are inherent to Nauru and the associated ceremonial aspects. Later in my presentation, I will discuss more on one particular Nauruan customary practice of Paba. It is spelled P-A-B-W-A. Section 14 of our Leadership Code Act outlines ethical conduct principles for leaders, including honesty, compassion, legal decision-making, avoiding conflicts of interest, refraining from soliciting gifts or economic benefits, and not assisting private entities or using government property for personal gain. Generally accepted gifts or rewards in kind are covered by Section 27 of the Leadership Code Act of 2016. Under this section, any gift, donation, or commission given to a public leader on a formal or informal occasion is to be considered a gift to the government and must be reported to the Ombudsman no later than 30 days after the gift was received. However, since we have yet to appoint our Ombudsman, the practice has been that the leader would declare to the relevant HOD, the minister, or the cabinet. Further, under Section 27, subsection 3, it provides an exception to Section 27, subsection 1. Section 27, subsection 1 is not applicable if the gift was given or accepted in accordance with Nauru's custom in accordance with the customs of another sovereign nation or for the benefit of a group or community rather than an individual. In this instance, the burden of proof lies with the leader who asserts that the gift was made in accordance with Nauru or any other custom. This assertion must be substantiated by evidence on the balance of probabilities. This is provided, and you can find this under section 27 sub 4 of our Leadership Code Act. A registry will be maintained by the Ombudsman to record all gifts received. In cases where the leader is uncertain about the gift, they may seek guidance from the Ombudsman. The rules pertaining to gifts are that any item exceeding the worth of $1,000, whether those gifts exchanged or received are in the customary obligation, it necessitates disclosure and notification to the Ombudsman. Any gifts that exceed a value of $2,000 must be relinquished to the Ombudsman and subsequently auctioned off. The resulting proceeds must be deposited in the government treasury and appropriately identified as proceeds derived from the auctioning of gifts. Any present received, even customary gifts worth less than $2,000, may be kept for one's own use or advantage. This is allowed under section 27 sub 6 of our Leadership Code Act. In relation to general election in Nauru, I will highlight two provisions of the Electoral Act 2016. The act of offering one's vote or support to a candidate for an election in exchange for any property or benefit is considered to be an act of bribery, which is an offense that is created under section 124 of our Electoral Act of 2016. Further, under section 124, it provides an offense provision whereby whoever is found guilty and convicted would be fined $10,000, not exceeding $10,000, or can be imprisoned for 2 years or to both. Further, section 129 of the Electoral Act establishes an electoral treating offense. This provision applies to anyone with the intent to corruptly influence a voter at an election who firstly offers cash or promises or provides food, drink, or entertainment. Secondly, offers or promises to give cash or to pay for food, drink, or entertainment. Thirdly, offers or provides transportation to or from polling stations. And fourthly, offers, promises, or gifts, or gives a gift, donation, or prize, including if the offer was taken before, including cash to or for any other person, club, or association. It is important to note that it does not matter if the offer was taken before, on, or after election day, or if the promise is kept before, on, or after election day. However, section 19 sub 3 of our Electoral Act provides an exception wherein the individual who extended the offer or promise may demonstrate that it was done or made as a result of a customary obligation. In a nutshell, only voters can be charged with the offense of bribery, while the offense of electoral treating is predominantly against electoral candidates, although it can include voters as well. The exception of customary obligation only applies for the offense of electoral treating. The fluidity of culture is a defining characteristic characteristic of its dynamic nature, indicating that culture experiences ongoing transformation regularly, whether in subtle or noticeable manners. Identifying the cultural dynamics in operation can be a challenging task due to the diverse modes of communication and expression employed by different groups of people. The creation and reviewing of laws at both the national and international level have contributed significantly to the tremendous progress that has been made in Nauru regarding the addressing of issues related to corruption. In order to effectively deal with issues relating to fighting corruption, Nauru is continually strengthening both its legal structure and its mechanisms for law enforcement. That brings me to the Nauruan culture of Paba. Most of you will be wondering, what is the Nauruan culture of Paba? I am informed that the actual cultural practice of Paba is that a family member, a friend, or a colleague of someone who has achieved something visits and offers a gift to the successful person as an expression of being proud of their achievement. When the successful person accepts the gift, he or she is required to give something in return as a token of gratitude for the gift. This is the promise. Thus, in the original practice of Paba, the elements of offer and promise were much clearer. For instance, a successful candidate in a general election, the close relatives visit the residence of the successful candidate and Paba's a vehicle or any other items. The vehicle may be owned by any other person who shares the same residence with the successful candidate. The individual who possesses legal ownership of the vehicle has the right to repossess the said vehicle. However, such an action would be considered impolite or inappropriate. Therefore, it is common for individuals to refrain from retracting or rejecting those who Paba a vehicle or any other item. The use of currency in the form of money or cash is similar to any other Pacific community, is relatively modern practice. In earlier times, gifts were often exchanged in the form of mats, handicrafts, and other valuable possessions. As time advanced, and other cultural influences became more prominent, the tradition of Paba underwent changes. Nauruan legislature deemed it appropriate to preserve this tradition and accord it appropriate acknowledgement by permitting it as an exemption to the offense of electoral treating. The exception in question is constrained in section 129 subsection 1 of the Electoral Act of 2016 exclusively, thereby ensuring that it is not subject to misuse. Conventions and international laws serve as a testament to the progress made by modern society. It is essential to acknowledge that certain laws may not be specifically designed to cater to the distinct requirements of particular countries. Nauru is a nation that upholds unique customary obligations and traditions and acknowledges the importance of enacting laws that align with these customs and traditions. To conclude, Nauru has established a framework where we believe anti-bribery laws and customary obligations can coexist, as previously mentioned. It is imperative to strike a compromise between the conflicting matters at hand in order to ensure a continuation of Nauru customary obligations while simultaneously adhering to the requirements set forth by our national and international laws. Thank you. That is all from me at the moment.
Thank you very much, Mele. That was very enlightening. This now brings us to our third and final speaker in this webinar, and I'm very delighted to welcome the Commissioner of the Fijian Independent Commission Against Corruption, Mr. Rashmi Aslam, as our final presenter today. Mr. Aslam is a lawyer with 20 years experience, specializing in the prosecution of serious and complex fraud, corruption, and white-collar crimes. Mr. Aslam joined the FICAC back in 2012 as a senior prosecutor and has worked his way up through the organization until he became its first commissioner in April last year. Much of Fijian jurisprudence in the areas of corruption and fraud can be traced to the many high-profile corruption cases that Mr. Aslam has prosecuted, and we look forward to hearing his insights on the issue of gift giving. Welcome, Commissioner Mbuluvinaka.
Bulavinaka, and thank you so much for your kind introduction, DPP. And I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Right. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to bring the story or the side of the event from Fijian aspects and from FICAC, what we preach, what we educate to the community in regards to gift giving. So it's still a hotly debated argument, hotly debated topic in the community, in all levels. Very often this has been brought as a defense in court of law to justify the corrupt bribery or the corrupt gift giving. And many times we've seen even the judicial officers sometimes get confused whether it's an acceptable gift or a corrupt gift, and where is the line exactly. So having said that, I would like to emphasize gift giving is not a unique aspect only in Fiji or Pacific. It happens across the world in most of the cultures, starting far east from China to the northwest in Northern America. In Chinese culture, there is something called lacy or lassi, where during the New Year's, they provide a small red color envelope to which contains a small amount of money actually, and it's given to everyone they meet, including the public servants. So the postmen to police officers in the area, they all receive this, used to receive it. So it was common, particularly in Hong Kong. If you look at the Northern American indigenous culture, including the Eskimos, they had some practice called potlatch, where they generously give gifts to public officials, the government institutions, including their legislative council. So it's not an isolated issue only in Pacific. It happens around the world. And is it a bad thing? Is it a negative thing? Or has it been overly used, that the defense of culture is overly used to justify corrupt dealings over and over again? And indeed, sometimes we can say that the culture has been actually abused to bring this as a defense in many occasions. So today, I'm thankful to my previous two speakers, the distinguished speakers, for providing some insight from their respective jurisdictions. What I'm going to do today is actually not to delve very in depth into the laws, because this is something that we deal here in Fiji with the community on a daily basis, because the community sometimes has a misconception that gift giving is accepted. It's strongly part of the culture. Therefore, it can be freely applied within the public service as well. So in this topic, when it comes to that argument, how do we deal with the public? And how do we draw the line and carefully give them some sort of a practical guideline in a very simplified formula to identify which areas of gift giving is accepted in the public service and which gifts could be actually deemed as corrupt, bribery-related gifts. Now, the common perception is that the line between a gift and a corruption or a corrupt gift or a bribery is very blurred, or it's not very clear, or it's a gray area. But when we speak to community, of course, the first thing that we confidently say is no, it's not that blurred. Many a times, or majority of the times, if you carefully assess, there is a clear-cut line. I would say around 90% of the time, if we just go examples by examples within the sectors of public service, we can clearly differentiate the bona fide or gift in good faith and the corrupt gifts given to the public service. So it's sometimes a surprise to many of them to say, is that can be that simple? And we would like to keep it simple. And this is how we keep it simple. So let me just share my brief presentation I have prepared. And the gift giving and the public servant, of course, is, as I explained to you earlier, somehow is closely connected. The issue would be now, how do we differentiate the line, or how do we identify the line between a bona fide gift and a corrupt gift when it comes to the public service? And as I promised you earlier, I'm going to keep it very simple in a way that a simple layman in the community can understand the difference between these two. So just to speak on gift, I believe the two former speakers have shed their lights on them. Gift is a very known phenomenon. Always there is a monetary consideration to a gift, but not necessarily. We've seen that certain favors, sexual exploitations, and sometimes certain defenses that the suspects bring in as well because of their ignorance, such as loans. For example, they say, this is not a gift, this is a loan, I'm planning to pay it back. So you can't consider this as a bribe. So these are also considered as favors under the definition of advantage, and definitely, therefore, it comes within the interpretation of a bribe. So the only exception here in Fiji and in some other countries, as we've seen, is the entertainment, particularly the food and the beverage given in that particular occasion to consume is the only exception. But of course, that doesn't extend to lunch money. If you accept money, even if it's as your lunch money, that can be deemed or should be deemed as a bribe. Just to identify what is the scope of this gift or an advantage, it can go further on, and it's defined clearly in the law. At the same time, it's common sense to know what exactly can be a gift. We all know the definition of public servant, and I'm not going to go into details about that. So To public, we say, at what point in time can you actually start thinking whether this particular gift can be corrupt or not? And in order to tailor their vision, we explain them the meeting point. So obviously there is a public servant, and there is a person, a member from the community or the service, the person who requires the service of the public servant, and there occurs an official meeting. So if I may call this as a meeting point, and the public servant does something at this point in his public capacity, and always that capacity is important. It's not in his personal capacity or any other capacity, it's his capacity as a public servant. And then he provides that service, and there, on the other side, there is a customer or the person who receives the service. It is very important at every stage to identify this meeting point. Once you identify the meeting point, we explain the purpose of the gift, the meaning of the gift, and as opposed to the purpose, the values of the public service as well. So if I may explain this briefly, for example, the gift with the purpose that occurs at the meeting point or even at the later stage, but it actually starts with the meeting point. And what is the motive of the giver, or what is the motive of the solicitor of that particular gift? And there are, of course, many values under public service. I just selected 3 values for the purpose of this presentation. These are some values that the public servant must uphold. For example, equality, impartiality, and indiscriminatory services and the actions, which means the service that he provides must be seen as fair and reasonable, without any favor, without any fear, or without any undue influence due to the gift. So it becomes simple, therefore, if you apply the common sense carefully to any meeting point between a public and a public servant, and then ask the questions, what exactly is the purpose of the gift? And then this gift, can it be, can it compromise the duty of the public servant? Or even if it doesn't compromise, can it be seen as compromising the duty of the public servant? And would there be a conflict, therefore, occurs in that? So these are the questions, actually, we ask the public to start thinking on and dwell on that. So I think it's a right place for me to say, when we apply this simple formula and subsequently we'll take them through various examples, I can confidently say 90% of the time, or 90% of the public service can be clearly identified as areas where if a gift giving occurs, obviously it can be deemed as a bribery or a corruption. What I'm trying to say is around 90% of the time, you can easily draw the clear line. And the gray area is 10% or less than 10%, because it's important to give that confidence and the knowledge to the public so that they themselves know how to deal with the situation or how to advise another member of the public in terms of giving gifts, and then not to use culture as a defense. So from here onwards, I would give you some examples to, or we will give some examples to the community to ask them to use their common sense and identify the meeting point. And at that meeting point, what sort of gift can occur and what kind of a purpose could there be for that gift? And then With that purpose, can there be any compromise or breach of their public service values? It's a very simple exercise if you use examples. So let me just use few examples we use, for example. The first one is a police officer who's receiving a gift from a complainant whilst attending to that particular complaint. Now, police officer is receiving a gift from a complainant. We ask the community to think. Now, if you are the complainant, if you are the person who's subjected to the investigation, the person of interest or a suspect, and if you get to know that the police officer has received a gift from the complainant, how would you feel about it? Would you expect an impartial inquiry from him? Would you expect a fair or reasonable decision from him? Most likely not. And vice versa. For example, you, as a complainant, lodged a complaint and the police officer is investigating, and you subsequently get to know that the police officer has received some gift from the suspect. So as a complainant, can you expect a fair, impartial inquiry from the investigator? Even if the investigator actually conducts himself while receiving the gift, what would be the perception of the complaint? Obviously, there is a breach in the values. So is that simple? Is there a gray area here, or is it clear cut? So the public start understanding here. Of course, there is no gray area. It's a clear cut area here. And no one should be using culture as a defense. And we should put our foot down and clearly say this is corruption. Just one example. Moving forward, the second example. Let's say a patient is desperate to get his surgery done without waiting in the long waiting list. And he is able to offer some money to the public servant who is in charge of the surgery schedules and advance his surgery. Now, what happens here? Is there a fair allocation, or is the decision can be fair? What about the other serious surgeries that's actually waiting for a long time? So this is another area. It's very easy for public to clearly say, look, there is no gray area here. If somebody receives a bribe or a gift under any pretext, whether it's culture or otherwise, this is corruption because it breaches the values of the public service. Likewise, a judicial officer hearing a case, receiving a gift from one party without the knowledge of the other party, and likewise. This is not a gray area at all. And another example would be a businessman gifting a procurement officer who's in charge of a tender who he has bid for. Now, if the persons or the businessmen who have tendered as well get to know this particular businessman has given a gift to this particular person, can it be seen that the person's work, the public official's work, as impartial? Definitely not. So these are very simple examples we used. And then we can go on and on and on to show this is a situation most of the time, at least the 90% of the times within the public service, and you can clearly draw the line. There is a very limited gray area here. And we invite them, you just go ahead and take a list of all the sectors within the public service. From police to social welfare officers to judiciary to covering every stage. And then identify the probable meeting points of the public service and see whether if there is a gift given at that particular meeting point, whether in good faith or bad faith, is that an acceptable thing? And through this exercise, we have seen that it's quite easy to speak to public and make it very clear that the line is, most of the time, is not blurred, it's not gray, it's a clear one. However, having said that, there are a few areas there can be some gray areas as well. So we'll be moving on to them. Those gray areas, for example, my example set 2, I have given few occasions there where a company providing telecommunication services gives a latest iPhone to the public servant who's dealing with the contract. For example, there is a government department and they require about 50 mobile phones. And then they go to the mobile service providers, so phone service providers. Since the deal is very lucrative, they offer one latest iPhone to the IT officer who is in charge of that particular procurement. Now, here in this situation, is the line very clear? Most of the time, the public understand, yeah, the line is clear. If the iPhone is given to the public servant for his personal use, obviously then he will have some sort of an obligation towards the company to keep giving these kind of procurements. Or they actually start a sort of relationship where the further dealings can be more easy and more favoritism can happen in that way. On the other hand, if the public servant is quite diligent here, and if he decides, look, I cannot accept any personal benefits here, and then he clearly draws his line, and then the company is thereafter persisting, say, look, it's not for you. This is a sort of a discount or an incentive that we anyway give to anybody. So therefore, please accept it. Now, probably sometimes you might see that, okay, the line is sort of getting slightly blurred here. So how do we deal with the situation? There we, of course, advise public servants in certain ways. This is how you deal with the situation, and maybe I can explain that in a while. There is another blur area sometimes. This is from the public perception. Like, for example, you, in the same situation, in a public procurement between department and a mobile service provider, and the mobile service provider gives small gifts like merchandises. Like, you know, it's a corporate practice. Most of the large-scale companies have the merchandises or small gifts, you know, which their company name or the logo is engraved. They are usually the pens or the notebooks, etc. So can they be treated as a corrupt gift? During your business dealing as a public servant with this company, if they offer merchandises, what do you do? Do you deny them or you accept them? Where is the line? What's the criteria? So probably this is an area the public or a public servant might think is slightly blurred or gray. The third set of example is mainly involving culture. Let me give you two scenarios here. First is a social welfare officer or officers, when they meet with the villagers in the community, they receive traditional gifts. Or let's say a community together present their cultural gifts to public officers who were involved in building their community hall or the bridge on the day of its ceremonial opening. It happens very often in any ceremonial opening. When a community is involved, they bring all their cultural gifts, pigs, mats, etc. And they present this to public officers. Now, what is this? But this happens in open. It's not secret. It's a known practice. But what should the public officer do here? So with these examples, again, if I may reiterate, 90% of the time, the line is clear. The 10% or the leftovers, we need to tread carefully. This is where we need to identify the meeting point and the gray areas carefully to see how to deal with this situation in the best interest of the public servant to protect his role and also protect him from corruption. Now, in this gray area, I, in my hindsight, have developed into two different areas. For example, as I said, the corporate gifts, there can be gray area. The cultural gift, there can be an area where public servant or the community is slightly confused whether our culture of giving gifts, our hospitality, our generosity, or the reciprocity can be deemed as an offense, and will it put the public servant into trouble? Now, that little gray area, this is how we advise the public to deal with. When it comes to corporate gifts, the first question the public servant need to keep in his mind is this. This is the pertinent question that he himself has to ask. Would this gift be given, or he could solicit that gift effectively if the person or the public servant in question were not the kind of public servant he in fact was? Now, let me explain this with an example. Going back to the same scenario, the IT officer is responsible for procurement of 50 cell phones from the mobile service provider. And in the course of that procurement, the company gives him an iPhone and tells them, look, this is for you, just keep it, your personal benefit. Now, will the company give the same kind of gift for any other public servant who just comes for a mere private business or a private to obtain just his phone, etc.? Or is it just tailor-made to target that person because he brings this lucrative deal and it's a personal gift for him? This kind of gift the company definitely wouldn't have offer to any other person. It's tailored for him because he brought the business. Well, if that is the case, then it definitely is a corrupt gift, bribery, because it aims to influence the public servant. The public servant sometimes asks questions in that situation. Look, but we haven't done any favor in return to that company. It's the normal course of work. I haven't done anything in return. I just did my official work. So, in other words, there is no quid pro quo. But in Fijian jurisdiction and in many other jurisdictions, this still is deemed as bribe, because this is a situation where you sort of, or the company start grooming the public servant and start keeping or building that relationship with the public servant to keep the public servant, also keep the company in public servant's good book. So when it comes to next procurement, obviously the public servant knows, okay, this particular company provides these sort of advantages directly to me. So that's a situation that the law tries to avoid by bringing this scenario. Even if there is no quid pro quo, that situation can be a bribe. Now, this is how to avoid the situation in the corporate culture. If it's personally targeted you, it's definitely for your personal benefit. And of course, you can say no and avoid it, then just simply do so. Say no and protect yourself. Avoid any personal benefits that you can derive from this official dealing. That's the key. If you can't really avoid the offer, but you can avoid the personal, take it as a personal benefit. For example, if they are anyway offering you an extra 1 or 2 phones, the key is to protect your integrity and to control your greed. The key is transparency. So obviously you are going to declare this to your superiors, and you are going to say, instead of, or when we bought 50 phones, 2 extra phones were given as incentives. Or I received this much discount for this. So it's not my personal, this is part and parcel of the deal. Therefore, it must be used for the benefit of the public service. That's how you deal with the situation. When it comes to merchandises, when you apply the same test, when you ask that question, would these kind of gifts be given, particularly to you because you brought the lucrative deal, or is it just discriminately given to anybody who comes for the service? Obviously, the merchandises, like any company, provides to anybody, whether you are a public servant or not. So you can clearly draw your line here. When you just receive a small, it's not a big monetary value, or a pen or a notebook from the company, even within the public service, or it could be even given to you in your personal capacity when you don't even have a deal with them, it's not a corrupt gift. So the line is very clear in that line, in that area as well. That's briefly about the corporate gifts and the corporate culture. So I think we'll move on to the cultural gifts. This area is quite sensitive, but easy to understand and accept, and again, draw the line clearly. Often these cultural gifts occur in open places. There is no secretive deal here. It happens openly in open places. And it involves most of the time a group of public servants, and very rarely just one person. Right? The cultural gifts are not personal benefits. They are of traditional nature. And the issue is, most of the time, the cultural gifts are unavoidable, or the refusing the cultural gift can be deemed rude. This is where the situation. So if that's the case, then how do you deal with the situation? How do you avoid it? If it's an unavoidable corporate or cultural gift, the key here is to keep a clear internal policy mechanism to deal with that situation. These situations can be always anticipated, particularly the cultural ones. It won't just happen all of a sudden, or wouldn't occur, overnight. If you are engaging with the community, and when it comes to an end, and you obviously know that there is going to be a ceremony, handing over ceremony, these gifts can be exchanged and this can occur. So these are things that the public servants can clearly anticipate. And these gifts by no means are personal gifts to you. Even if it was personally given to you, through the internal policy and the mechanisms, there has to be a clear procedure within a public sector to deal with this situation. The first thing is, what we encourage is declaration. Declare, declare, declare. To your superiors, there has to be a mechanism on that. There has to be a mechanism on registering those kind of traditional or corporate gifts given, and a clear documentation on that line. It can never be secretive. The key is transparency there. If it's unavoidable, if it's difficult, you have a policy how to deal with that. There is a mechanism of declarations, registrations, and also handing over, and the same policy will dictate what would be the next step, and how these particular gifts be used for the benefit of the larger public service, as opposed to just one person's personal benefit. So the transparency is the key. This is just a simple formula we take the community through. If you do this for one whole day, instead of just 10 minutes, go through sector by sector in the public service and explain them the meeting point, and then explain to them that the line is clear here. You just simply apply your common sense, know the public service value, and you see that there can be a breach, and there can be a conflict, there can be a compromise. always you will find that. And then the line is very clear on that line. If you are not very sure, obviously, then you will have your internal mechanism deal with the situation. And the key is transparency. It's not for your personal benefit. Always declare, register, and then be in the clear line all the time in order to protect your integrity. So that would be the summary. Again, I confidently say only in less than 10% of the public engagements are the gray areas. And that gray area can be clearly regulated through transparent internal mechanism of gift declarations. And it is mandatory to have them. So in tandem with these kind of community programs, we also have our anti-bribery campaign, where we speak to public servants. This is not a very legal basis or awareness session that we explain about the law or consequences of breaches, etc., etc. This is a very simple awareness session or a simple program that actually we try to speak to the public servants' heart and try and see whether we can influence the way they think. So it's educational. We ask them to value their integrity through various examples we give them. And we ask them to respect the value of the public service. And the culture is hardly a defense. We explain that to them. And it's often avoidable. If it's unavoidable, be honest and transparent. And aware of the consequences if you keep on engaged in these kind of activities, and if you're found guilty, what kind of consequences that it brings to you personally, your family. How does the family deal with the situation? The blemish you bring to you, your parents, your relatives, your children is forever. And when we emphasize on these things, actually the public servants start carefully, they become serious and they think of it. And at the end, this little money they earn, it doesn't really help him or his family in the long run, or in the country at large. So we, through this, if I may call a brainwashing session, we try to make them patriotic and then proactively say no to bribes. And then they wear the badge proudly. And then they are not hesitant to wear the badge proudly in their public service. If they are hesitant, we would know as to why they are hesitant. Or if they wear it proudly, when they come to the meeting point with the public public know, okay, the guy is wearing the badge. I can't have any hanky-panky with him. So that's a message we give. So it's a very practical and simple program. We have started with the help of UNDP in 2020. However, due to a pandemic, we could not really effectively continue with the way we planned. However, we have rejuvenated the program and now it's going ahead full board. That's my perspective, a little experience as a prosecutor and also a corruption prevention officer engaged in FICAC work. And again, I hope you're not surprised by my assertion saying that this is not very, not a sort of a difficult area or a gray area. It involves a lot of common sense. When you overemphasize this as a gray area, that's where the perpetrators actually start using culture and abusing culture and start using as a defense. So you need to be clear-cut at all times as much as possible. Thank you so much for your listening.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Commissioner, for that thought-provoking presentation. Nakavakalevu. Now that brings us to the end of our webinar, ladies and gentlemen. I now invite the ever so incredible Meg Rudder, Senior Legal Officer of the AGD Canberra, to see if there's any questions that have been posed through the chat.
Thank you, Chair. No, we do not have any questions at this time, but perhaps if people wanted to email them through to the PILON Secretariat, we could answer them at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. I hope everyone has enjoyed the stories and the experiences and the thoughts of our three wonderful presenters, and that you've learned more about the difficulties that law and justice officials have to face when distinguishing between corrupt conduct and gift giving. On behalf of the PILON Working Group, Corruption Working Group, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on money laundering, which will be held on Thursday, the 28th of September, same time, 1 p.m. Nauru time. We hope you will mark this in your diaries. And again, thank you to our three presenters. Thank you very much. Thank you all.